Flames rise into the sky. A 19-year-old girl is tied to a wooden stake. Thousands watch in silence. An English soldier whispers, "We have burned a saint." How did a teenage village girl become commander of an army, only to be condemned as a heretic? Let's turn the clock back and investigate the remarkable story of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was born in 1412 to a farming family in the small village of Domrémy, France. For centuries, she has often been described as a poor peasant girl. Modern historians, however, paint a more nuanced picture. Her family owned land, raised livestock, and were respected members of their community. They were ordinary villagers, not nobles, but neither were they the impoverished peasants of later legend. Like most village girls of her time, Joan probably never learnt to read or write. When she later needed to communicate with kings, commanders, and enemies, she dictated her letters to scribes. Although she had no formal education, Joan possessed an extraordinary memory. She learned Catholic prayers and teachings by listening at church and became deeply devoted to her faith. That remarkable memory would later astonish even the learned churchmen who questioned her at trial. France was in crisis. For generations, England and France had been fighting what became known as the 100 Years' War. Villages were destroyed, armies marched across the countryside, and many French people had begun to lose hope that their nation could ever be united again. Joan was only 13 years old when her life changed forever. She later testified that while working in her father's garden one summer afternoon, she heard a voice unlike any she had ever known. "I was 13 when I first heard a voice from God for my help and guidance. The first time I heard this voice, I was very much frightened. It was midday, in the summer, in my father's garden." Joan said the voices belonged to St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. They gave her an extraordinary mission. She was to save France. At first, Joan kept these visions to herself, but as the months passed, the voices became more urgent, telling her she must seek out the Dauphin, Charles, and help him reclaim the French throne. At the time, Charles ruled only part of France. The kingdom was divided, morale was low, and many questioned whether he was the rightful heir. England had already won major victories, including the crushing defeat of the French army at Agincourt in 1415. Most people believed France was losing the war. Joan believed God had another plan. At just 17 years old, she set out on an extraordinary journey. Travelling nearly 350 miles through enemy territory, mostly at night, she rode for 11 days to reach Charles's court. There, according to tradition, Charles disguised himself among his courtiers to test the young peasant girl. Joan walked straight through the crowd and greeted him. "I bring you news from God," she said, "that our Lord will restore your kingdom, bring you to be crowned at Reims, and drive out your enemies. Set me bravely to work, and I will raise the Siege of Orléans." Whether miracle or remarkable intuition, the moment left the court astonished. She then shared details of a private prayer Charles had never spoken publicly, convincing him that her mission was genuine. After theologians questioned her beliefs and found no evidence of heresy, Charles made an astonishing decision. He placed a 17-year-old peasant girl at the head of the French army. Joan rode into battle carrying a large white banner depicting Christ and angels. She later said she preferred carrying her banner to her sword because she wanted to encourage her soldiers rather than harm her enemies. The Siege of Orléans had dragged on for 7 exhausting months. France desperately needed a victory. Joan gave them hope. Her courage inspired the French army to launch a series of bold attacks against the English fortifications. With Joan's spirit, she led the French to successfully capture the English, starting with the fortress of Saint-Lô. A week into the fighting, an English arrow struck Joan in the shoulder. She was carried from the battlefield while her wound was dressed. Most commanders would have stayed behind. Joan returned to the front lines before the battle was over, carrying only her banner, urging her soldiers forward. Victory followed victory. Joan urged Charles to march to Reims, the traditional city where French kings were crowned. Although the journey crossed nearly 150 miles of hostile territory, many towns surrendered without a fight. Historians later called it the Bloodless March. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII, with Joan standing proudly beside him. In recognition of her service, Joan and her family were granted noble status. Joan believed her mission had been fulfilled and prepared to head home. King Charles VII asked Joan to remain with the army to continue fighting, and she agreed. On May 23, 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian soldiers. Charles VII made no serious attempt to rescue the young woman who had helped place him on the throne. Instead, the Burgundians sold Joan to the English for 10,000 livres. Joan of Arc was held captive for months in a tower, where she attempted to escape by leaping from the tower. Landing in a moat, she wasn't seriously hurt. Then came her trial. The preliminary investigations began on the 9th of January, 1431. First came the investigation into her life, her habits and her virtue, which included testimony of witnesses. Her virginity was also questioned and examined. She was labelled a virgin after the exam. None of these inquiries found anything that could be used against Joan. This angered Pierre Cauchon, as he needed something to hold against her at the trial. He accused the man in charge of the investigation of being a traitor and a bad man, and didn't pay him for his work. In spite of not finding anything, Joan was put on trial. The trial lasted over 4.5 months. Joan, only 19 and without legal counsel, endured over 100 grueling sessions of questioning, while defending herself against charges of witchcraft and heresy. They tried to trap Joan with complex questions about theological. She was asked if she was in a state of grace, knowing that church doctrine held that no one could definitively know, and answering yes would be heresy. If she answered no, that was an admission of guilt. Joan sidestepped the trap with her answer of, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." They drilled her over and over about her visions and saints she heard. They were hoping she would confess to demonic contact rather than divine intervention. On May 24, 1431, the court declared Joan was guilty of heresy. The same day she was brought to the scaffold at the cemetery of St. Queen. There, she renounced her religious beliefs in a last attempt to save her life. She also said she would go back to wearing women's clothing. It worked, and Joan was given a life sentence in jail and returned to her cell. When they found her wearing men's clothing, which she wore to protect herself against assault, since she was in a men's prison, she was declared a relapsed heretic. On May 28th, she was sentenced to die by fire. On May 30th, 1431, the morning of her execution, Joan was given permission to make her last confession and receive communion. Outside, thousands gathered to watch her walk to her death. She was made to hear a final sermon, then passed to the authorities to be tied to a tall wooden pyre. Before the fire was lit, an English soldier, moved to tears, tied 2 sticks together to make a crude cross. Joan kissed it and held it to her chest. She also instructed a priest to hold a larger crucifix high enough for her to see through the smoke. As the flames engulfed her, she was heard shouting, "Jesus!" The onlookers, watching the fire consume her, were deeply moved, with many in tears. It made a lasting impression on the massive crowd. After Joan took her last breath, the executioner pulled back the burning wood so the crowd could see that she had truly died, and that she was, indeed, a young woman. The fire was then rebuilt, which reduced her body almost entirely to ashes, which were scattered into the Seine River to prevent her followers from collecting relics. According to later testimony, the executioner became so distressed by what he had done that he feared he had condemned his own soul by executing a saint. He sought forgiveness by going to confession. Joan of Arc's death was not the end of her story. 25 years after her execution, a new trial was ordered at the request of her family. Witnesses who had known Joan came forward to testify, and on July 7, 1456, the Church declared her original trial deeply flawed. The verdict of heresy was overturned, and Joan was officially declared innocent, restoring both her name and her family's honour. More than 4 centuries later, on April 18, 1909, Pope Pius X beatified Joan, recognizing her life of extraordinary faith and virtue. Then, on May 16, 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, she was canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church. Today, Joan of Arc is one of the patron saints of France. She remains a symbol of courage, faith, conviction, and perseverance in the face of impossible odds. Her story continues to inspire people around the world, regardless of nationality or background. She never ruled a kingdom. She never wrote a book. She never lived to see her 20th birthday. Yet one determined young woman changed the course of French history forever. Her greatest victory was not won on the battlefield. It was winning a place in history that no fire could ever destroy. If this story inspired you, join us as we continue uncovering the lives of women who changed the world. Subscribe to Heroines of History and keep the light of history alive. And let us know in the comments who your favorite heroine is. Bye for now.